see you, man. How are things today? Are you in Colorado today?
I am in my office, leaving town in about 5 hours for an event in Tennessee for about 5 days.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, anyway, well, just for those people don't remember, can you just you're one of the proprietors of Colorado Craft Beef. You kind of went through it on the business side of things. Kind of give everybody your background again, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So my wife and I own and operate Colorado Craft Beef. She is fifth generation on the family ranch here in Colorado, where I'm sitting. We raise our own cattle. We ship them nationally once a week. We've got subscribers from Florida to Hawaii, and we don't put anything under our label that we didn't bring to its natural endpoint at our place. So we raise everything. We handle the process all the way through. And when beef is shipped, odds are I probably put it in the box myself. We come from a pretty heavy agricultural background. I've got a degree in agricultural business. I've worked in agriculture my whole career. My wife has a master's degree in cattle nutrition. And as you can guess, since she's fifth generation on the family ranch, she's been working in the cattle industry since she knew how to say the word work. We've got our sixth generation growing up on the ranch right now. We've got two little girls that I think Emma's first word was steak. Shout out to Dr. Baker for that. And other than that, happy to be here. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, awesome, Jeff. And just for the record, you took up a carnivore diet as well and lost a fair bit of weight and noticed significant improvements by doing so. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've been on carnivore at your gentle urging, I believe is how we could define that. For just about 2 years, I've been, probably 70 to 80% carnivore, down, 30 to 40 pounds, but I've taken up some other physical activities that have started to change muscle mass. And, my recovery in jiu-jitsu is significantly better due to carnivore. About the only thing I've noticed is I've got to, use those LMNT supplements when I'm rolling just to keep the cramps down. But other than that, keeps me lean, makes me feel better. And I'm on the last hole of every belt I own. I'm going to probably have to buy some leather here before too long.
Hey, Jeff, let me ask you about just some basic cattle stuff. Cause you came, stopped by and visited me at my new house. In fact, you're one of the first visitors we've actually out of the house. We haven't finished it yet, but you came by and we cooked up some steaks and we kind of had a long discussion about some of the stuff, some of the science. So just for people that don't know, I mean, there's different, heifers and steers and, bulls and cows. Can you just give us a basic background on this? Cause I want to, cause that impacts the meat quality. I didn't realize that, but can you talk about some basic definitions? Because I think a lot of people that aren't in agriculture don't even know what a heifer is or don't understand that term.
Certainly. So we'll just kind of start top down. We're all familiar with what a bull is. We see them on TV. We see them, they're pretty photogenic from a, big muscular standpoint. In the US, bulls aren't typically put into the commercial beef chain. So the odds of us eating a bull here is really low. On the flip side, if you go to Europe or places like that, it's actually against the law to castrate bulls if it's not medically required. So most of the meat you eat in Europe is actually bull meat, which can affect the flavor, changes things a little bit. So regionally, those things change a lot. A cow is a female bovine that has had a calf. A heifer is a female bovine that has never had a calf. So on average, about 50% of the fed beef chain that we're going to be able to buy at the grocery store or order from somebody is going to be a heifer. Because obviously not all the heifers in the beef chain need to make it into the herd to produce more cows. So that's just an economic thing. That is actually going away to a degree. There are some people that are starting to use sexed semen so you can make sure you have a bull calf. And when you have a bull calf and you don't want that calf to reproduce, when you brand and vaccinate when they're young, usually in that 60-day range, we castrate them. They become steers at that point. So it's a male cow without the testicles. And most of them, actually almost all of them, go into the fed beef chain. And for instance, within Colorado Craft Beef, we feed exclusively steers because they grade better, they convert faster for an economic gain, but also if you can think of the hormonal difference between, say, a steer and a heifer, the steer doesn't have estrogen and other things going through their system, so they are more likely to lay down fat sooner. And as we all know in the carnivore community, fat is flavor. So if you start talking to someone about how they produce their beef, a lot of the folks in the, what I would call the direct to consumer self-production chain, some of them that are actually commercial cattle operators like my wife's family, they'll feed their cut-off heifers, they'll feed some cut-offs, and that's what they use for their beef. So you can imagine that may or may not contribute to a good tasting steak at the end. So not all beef is created the same. Breeds, of course, change things a little bit, but it also becomes a question of when you have those cows, those calves, and they're going to be steers. And, you know, at Colorado Craft Beef, we know those steers are going in a box. That is their whole job. And they are destined to that from the time we take them into our possession. We treat them as such. You can imagine that's maybe a little different if you have a heifer that doesn't breed back that then goes into the beef chain. So different operations can create different endpoints, which may or may not help the final product.
Let me ask you, I mean, I think we'll get back into this science stuff of the food, but do you, I mean, they just passed a stimulus package in Congress. Does that have any impact to you in the cattle industry? Have you seen what's come out of that yet? Has there been anything that you've seen definitively that you're either think it's good, bad, or indifferent? Do you know anything about that yet?
I know at one point they were trying to put a per head tax on the cattle industry from a global warming standpoint. I do know that got pulled out. Other than that, I'm not familiar with anything in that package that's going to, you know, materially affect the cattle industry. But that regulatory risk is out there pretty much everywhere.
Okay, that's interesting to know. Excited because you know, apparently it's thousands of pages. No one actually has read it before they passed it all the way or something.
Yeah, so I don't think I can definitively say that there's nothing in there, but to my knowledge, they haven't snuck anything else in.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine some of the pro ag groups would have had, you know, their folks going through it with a fine tooth comb to try to figure out what's going to impact them or what
For sure.
not. So, you know, you choose steers, you know, almost exclusively for the Colorado Craft version of that. Does in the U.S. what percentage of, you said it's about 50-50 basically, right? 50%
Yeah.
of the cows are male. That would seem to make sense, you know. So do you know what breed do you guys deal with?
We stick with an Angus base, not only from, you know, their ability to marble correctly and things of that nature, but Angus cattle are naturally a little smaller, and that fits in our boxes better because, you know, not a lot of people want a 2-pound ribeye that's, you know, the size of a dinner plate. So we've got to moderate that a little bit to make sure that our sizes are correct. But also, if you were to cross an Angus on a Charolais, which is the white breed, a lot of us have seen white cows. Some of those are going to be Charolais. They can also be yellow. Those Charolais are going to finish at 1,500 or 1,600 pounds, where a straight Angus is going to finish around 12 or 1,300. So you can imagine the frame size is different. The amount of steak or amount of meat you get off the animal is different. But then you have a natural endpoint that's further out. So you're less able to control some of that.
And what's the climate? You know, earlier this year, you know, the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, announced there was going to have a national meat out day. You know, to try to get people to stop eating meat or to cut back. What was the response like in Colorado to that particular?
You know, if he could do that every week, that would be awesome, because the majority of the industry pushed back. There were benefit dinners in almost every town. There was one group of cattlemen that got together and they rented like a dozen food trucks, parked them around the Capitol building in downtown Denver, and fed the homeless free meat. And then actually from a national standpoint, that, you know, the governor of Nebraska, the governor of Wyoming, Kansas, there was a bunch of states that actually declared it meat in day. So, and just the negative publicity that came around that, we saw a spike on our website of people just, you know, wanting to support the meat industry because they didn't understand why we were being vilified so much. So while everybody's entitled to their opinion, it did not go as well for him as he had hoped. But the odd part was he then posted something about how successful it was for the ranchers, and still tried to claim a victory. 2 days later. It was pretty preposterous.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of misinformation about the impact of cattle on climate. Not that there's no impact, but it's certainly overblown, and it seems like it's being scapegoated clearly. Okay, so back to the science behind this stuff. So I mean, you've got the breeding of the cattle, you select for steers. I know you and I talked about. You said the processor has a huge role in the final product. Talk about that a little bit. How you could take whatever cattle, but its processing is going to make a big difference.
Yeah. So if we back up just a little bit, just to kind of put everybody on the same page, I believe this conversation came about because you mentioned to me when we were having dinner, the flavor of your steak is, something I can pick out of a lineup. Where does that come from? And in general, that comes from a litany of combinations of breed, feed selection, et cetera, et cetera. But the biggest thing that starts to change the flavor profile of our beef is the dry aging process. So when we harvest animals, we dry age them for 21 days as a whole carcass before we break them down into steaks. Now, you may go to a butcher shop and you're going to find dry aged, whatever it may be. Well, that butcher shop likely got a whole ribeye and they dry aged that ribeye rather than dry aging the whole carcass, because 85% of the beef chain cannot dry age whole carcasses. It's just sheerly a real estate issue. So we're lucky enough to be able to harvest at a facility that has an ability to do that. That changes the profile. But I actually talked to my lovely wife, Kara, who is our cow nerd, and she pulled like 150 pages of data for me out of her former class notes. And I'll just read you the summary of this document from the beef checkoff called The Chemistry of Beef Flavor. And the summary says, overall, beef flavor results from a myriad of components present in varying proportions that are affected by the precursor compounds available, i.e. fatty acids, proteins, etc. This may depend on the breed of cattle and their diet, post-mortem changes like enzyme activity or aging, the muscle in which changes are occurring, addition of ingredients, whether enhancement or marination, storage conditions, time, temperature, gas, atmosphere, and humidity, heat treatment and post-heating storage. Development of meaty, beefy flavor may be accompanied by development of various off flavors like livery or rancid, because many of the same precursor compounds are in both flavor groups being differentiated by proportions of the various components and the absolute concentrations of them. Impacting flavor requires control of all these various facets of flavor development. So in general, the way that I summarize that is, this is just like wine. If there is a red wine that you really like, your wife may not like it. It's how different flavors come into your palate. And a big part of it is not going to be necessarily the animal, although that is a significant part of it, but the cooler temperatures, how much variation there is in the cooler temperatures, the aging process, and also how were they handled, what were they fed, and then maturity of the animal is probably the biggest one. In some of the fed beef chain of what we can find at the grocery store, some of those cattle are what we would call calf feds. They're weaned at 6 or 7 months of age from the mother cow ranch. They go straight to a feed yard, but we can understand from a metabolic standpoint, those animals are barely teenagers. So their frame hasn't grown to a point that they can put on the proper amount of muscle onto a larger skeleton to then lay down fat and then go intermuscular. So that's the thing to understand the most is when we get a great ribeye steak and it's really well marbled, the steps in the process that have to happen is we need a calf with a large enough frame to properly lay down muscle, to then lay down back fat from the proper diet. And only when they have enough back fat will they then put down intermuscular fat, which is the flavor that all of us like.
One of the things that I think you mentioned to me was that the steers preferentially will deposit, the marbling, the intramuscular fat, whereas the heifers or the cows will tend to deposit fat in the subcutaneous tissue. Is that correct? Was that something you mentioned
Not
to
really
me?
subcutaneous, but more internal. So, a heifer that is a female has a different type of hormone, and they're going to try to protect their inner organs with internal fat in their organ cavity, or start putting more of those nutrients towards reproductive health rather than growing meat like a steer does. So it's just the hormonal changes in those animals and what their body is, telling them to do based on genetics and just biology.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because there's qualitatively differences between the marbled fat and then the sort of group collective fat, whether it's around the organs or even subcutaneous. From what I've read about that, so it's interesting. So that maybe the steers have a more favorable fat profile. If you tend to believe that monounsaturated fat is more helpful, which there's people that certainly think that. One of the things because you mentioned dry aging, Jeff, and I want to, because I've got a dry aging device at home. I haven't used it in a bit because I still haven't kind of unpacked it yet. But when I dry age a subprimal ribeye or New York or something like that, I get a big pellicle on there that I've got to trim off. Is that happening on a whole carcass situation where they have a big thick pellicle they have to trim away, or is that not a feature of that part?
They will have to do that in the processing plant. But when you have grain finished beef, you have a fat cap down the back, and that's where that, outer skin develops, and you can trim that off the fat and you don't get into the meat. So like if you trim a big subprimal ribeye and it's got, a 3/4 inch fat cap on it, you can trim that fat off and it doesn't affect the meat. Where on the exposed side, when it's into the meat, you have to trim meat, which is why it's ideal to age the carcass in its entirety, because you have less surface area that you have to trim. But it's not a feasible option for the entire industry either.
Yeah, so the one thing that I've noticed is when I do dry age, and you have them in a restaurant where you get a dry age steak, it has a certain flavor profile. It's very, some people find it really good. Some people don't like it. I think it just depends, like you mentioned, but I don't see that with your product. I don't get that, like what I would consider a dry age flavor for like what I do at home. I mean, it just doesn't, I like the way yours tastes. It has a really unique, very good flavor, but it's not what I would equate as a typical dry age that I'm used to. Is there a reason? Any thoughts on that?
I think that's because we're able to dry age it as a whole animal. Because if you get something dry aged at a restaurant, it's almost 100% going to be dry aged in a dry aging device or dry aged in a big dry age warehouse that has, a couple hundred strip steaks, not necessarily the whole animal. So that enzymatic process is minimized to just that cut rather than the whole animal. It's more exposed to air and oxygen. And as fat starts to oxidize, it's going to change the flavor profile.
Very good. Besides, you said the finish, and you read a long description of what impacts the flavor, and there's kind of obviously a lot of things that are going on in there. How does there's a lot of people that are concerned about how, like, say, supermarket beef is treated, and how they keep it nice and red, where they add carbon monoxide. I'm not sure what they use, what one of their agents they are. How does how you finish versus and process differ from, say, what a grocery store might do?
Okay. Well, some of the beef you're going to get at the grocery store is going to be finished in a way similar to ours. They're going to have a high energy diet, which allows them to lay down the fat to then put intermuscular fat that's going to allow us to have the flavor we're all after. But when we harvest an animal, as I mentioned before, that animal hangs in the cooler for 21 days before it's broken down into steaks. What you find in a grocery store, that animal has been in and out of a very large processing plant in a matter of about 4 days, and it's on the road to somewhere. So you don't get a chance for that enzyme breakdown that's going to, take down some of that connective tissue, break down some of that other stuff that's going on in the meat. But the second thing the other thing that I noticed that's very telling in hours compared to what you might find at the store. Since we hang for so long, the meat is more dense because a lot of that water weight is gone. It's pulled out in the coolers. So you're not going to have that water waste. You're going to have a lot juicier steak, because if you take one of our ribeyes and you cook it on the Auto Wild grill that we used at your place, it's a really dense piece of meat. The fat renders and it stays in the meat, and you get that really buttery flavor. If you take a ribeye of the same exact makeup and you put it on the Auto Wild grill and it's from a grocery store and it's not been able to age, what it's going to do is all that moisture that's still in there, that water that's trapped in the meat, is going to start to liquefy and come out. And it creates a pathway for that fat to then render and come out as well. So you get a much drier steak because it's not as dense. It's got a lot more of the water in it.
Yeah, the water count was pretty interesting. You know, that the meat is, I don't know, 70% water generally, or, you know,
Yep.
and then as dry age, you lose quite a bit of that. So you're ending up with less water and more meat. And then probably the cooking times are quicker too. It's one of the things that,
Well, and
with
we
dry.
probably see an additional, if we go from a 14 to 21 day age, which, as I mentioned, our standard is 21. We've actually done the research in our same processing facility, and you're talking another 7 to 8% of carcass weight goes away in that last 7 days. And that's all water. So it's pretty incredible the amount of shrink that it takes out of the product. So when you're buying a 2-pound ribeye at the store that has all that water weight versus a 2-pound ribeye from us, you're buying, 8% less water.
And that I'm sure adds up over time. You know, have you seen issues with the supply chain affecting you guys right now? I know there's a lot of concerns just in general, and I'm sure it's impacting. I know somebody has commented that beef prices have doubled in their local area. Are you being impacted by shipping and that type of stuff?
Shipping, yes. Everything else we've actually been able to maintain. So I'm happy to say that, we started shipping beef in 2018, and we have not raised our beef prices since then. Now, granted, the company is getting larger. We're getting more scale of economy efficiencies, which allow us to hold our prices down. Cattle are more expensive than they've been for the last 3 years. Feed is more expensive, but because we've grown to such a level, we're able to keep those prices the same. We have had to institute different shipping costs because we have a 5 to 6% shrink rate with FedEx when we ship boxes that either don't arrive, or they arrive late, or, somebody drop kicks them for whatever reason it may be. And also we've seen about a 25% increase in our shipping costs just in the last 18 months with COVID. So shipping is what's beating us up. Luckily, our case costs haven't gone up. Our insulator costs haven't gone up. We've been able to find the other things we use on, a more economic basis. So we've been able to hold as tight as we can to, what we consider a fair price for what we do, while still trying to provide value to our customers. FedEx is just our biggest hang up at the moment.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, from your standpoint, I'm sure it's the same for anybody else that does a nationwide shipping campaign. So it averages out. If you're shipping up to, the tip of Florida or the tip of Maine, it's going to cost you more, and you prefer that people in the whatever the 3 or 4 state area around Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, a few other states would be optimal for you guys, correct?
Kind of. I actually, a great example, I spoke to a young lady in Tampa that runs a beef company similar to ours, and she wants to ship. And I said, well, you're going from hot to cold. So you're kind of going the wrong way with the shipping system. But also where she's at in Tampa, things are coming out of Tampa from the port and going out via FedEx. So now she's competing with all that outbound traffic. Where we're at in Colorado, we're actually really fortunate. I can ship to California for the same price I can ship to Chicago, because of the way the freight's moving, the way the machines or the trucks are moving for FedEx. So what we've found is, luckily we're in the center of the country, but if we look at the Carolinas are crazy expensive for us to get to, where we have a subscriber in Key West. He's actually not bad to get to because of how the freight's moving. So there's a lot of fish and everything coming out of Key West, coming north. They've got to get trucks back down there to get reloaded. So the logistics movement of different regions is really what impacts us the most, and learning where we can be the most effective, what makes sense to us. Same thing, we can get to Houston in 2 days, but it takes us 3 days to go to Lubbock, and Lubbock is 6 hours from here, and Houston's a 20-hour drive. So what's most critical for us is just learning the freight routes that are advantageous for us and advertising in those channels.
As far as like, do you guys do any, I know you're doing the box beef stuff. Are you doing any like for local people? Are you doing any like sides and quarters and stuff like that? Is that part of your practice?
Yeah. We do a lot of quarters and halves. We've got a few people that buy wholes. Actually, we sold a quarter beef yesterday to someone in Seminole, Florida. So that's going to ship out on Monday. So we send quarters and eighths and halves kind of all over the country, depending on where people like to order them. The boxes seem to work really well because a lot of people just don't have storage. They'll subscribe to a $150 box a month, and you just ship it out every, 4th of the month. Our system takes that. And then there's other people that, we've got a guy named Tim up in Michigan. He buys a half a beef twice a year, but he has a monthly subscription for a steak box to augment that extra burger. So it's just about whatever works for you. And hopefully we've got, things kind of optimized to a degree. And Steve, I just saw your question come up. Cost for a quarter from us is $915, and that includes freight. The one thing we've done, instead of saying, a quarter is this much per pound, we've streamlined it, and I can email you a breakdown of exactly what's in a quarter of a beef from us, because we don't want to have an awkward conversation of, hey, that steer was bigger than we expected it to be, because now you're going to owe us an extra $100. That's an awkward conversation. So we've streamlined a lot of that weirdness to just say a quarter is $915, a half is $1,700, and depending on where you're at, there's a little bit of a freight charge. Probably the most common thing we ship is going to be what we call the space saver, which is an eighth of a beef, and that's $500. And that all those prices include freight plus or minus.
Yeah, when you're shipping like a half or even a whole beef, I mean, interstate, I mean, how do you, is that just a bunch of boxes? Does this come with like 6 boxes, or how does that work? Or you don't have like a giant box or something?
No, you want to keep everything under 50 pounds. If you get over 50 pounds, FedEx hits you like another $17 a box for, additional handling charges. But we've got a hard-sided shipping box. I think I've sent one to you before. With that brisket in it, and then you just ship the box back. So we've got some bulk boxes we can ship with that hold up pretty well, and they come with a return label you send back to us, so there's actually no waste. So a quarter beef goes out in 3 of those, and a whole beef takes about 7. The space saver takes 2.
Okay, nice. So yeah, I know as somebody, I work for UPS, and I know they had a limit on how heavy the boxes could be, because people have to carry it, and some people don't want to carry 100 pounds at a time. It becomes awkward to do that. So interesting stuff. What are you guys projecting for the future as far as where you got? I know you've got some plans to expand. What are we likely to see over the next 2 to 5 years out of Colorado Craft?
Man, I think we're going to continue to get bigger. We started shipping beef in 2018. We are 14 times larger than we were the first year. So the growth curve has been a little crazy. We built a new building last summer. So we've got a walk-in freezer about 40 feet from me in the same building, where we can hold 45 animals at a time. That's all in cases. We're getting ready for our big Christmas rush. So we've got 300 cases pre-purchased right now that are going to start going out the week after Thanksgiving. And actually, we just started kind of a cool sidebar. I ran into Element owner Rob Wolf at the SBG Jiu-Jitsu gym in Kalispell. And we are getting a bunch of sample packs from Element that are going out in all of our Christmas boxes this year. just as a thank you to everybody and in partnership with Element. So, the more you run into good people like yourself and Rob Wolf and some of the other things, kind of the sky's the limit. Luckily, we are in a position that we can continue to grow. We have the ability to do so on the cattle side. As long as FedEx doesn't decide to shut down the terminal that's 30 miles away, we should be in good shape. We've got harvest dates scheduled, out to the end of 2023 right now, with some expected growth, and just going to keep doing what we do and going from there.
We hear a lot, I just saw something out of the UK, and there's just a tremendous media push towards plant-based diet, cut back on beef. But despite that, in the UK, they said that beef consumption and it was actually up. I mean, they're showing people eating more of it despite all this sort of push away from that. Are you seeing the same here in the US? Either with your company, or I'm sure you're in contact with other ranchers. Is the overall demand still very high and going up, or is it waning?
Well, there's a couple different things to look at from that standpoint. One is, what do I see with our individual customers? And what I've seen on just a very micro level with our company is a lot of people that would buy a quarter beef are now buying a half a beef because they found beef they like. Not to, pat ourselves on the back, but they're finding beef that they like, that they love to feed their family. The gentleman in Michigan I mentioned earlier, Tim, he's got 4 or 5 kids, I believe. And he said they won't eat beef from anywhere else. But now that they love to eat that burger, he's going through more than he ever has. So, maybe flavor, quality, some of those things are, tipping people the right direction. But on a global level, what we have to look at when we consider India, China, and other areas of the world, we've got more people going into the middle class worldwide than we've ever had before in the history of humanity. And those people that are going into the middle class, the very first thing they change is their food. They change from chicken to pork, or they change from chicken to beef. They want a steak, and our exports are going up because of that. Although I do believe that if you look at the data from NCBA or some of the other organizations, the things within the US are not changing significantly. I think we're still averaging, 80 to 83 pounds of beef per person in the US.
Yeah, certainly with the rising demand in, like you said, China, India, and then also Africa, which is going to start developing increasingly sophisticated taste when it comes to diet. We're going to see greater and greater demand. Are you, obviously methane is a topic. Are you seeing any sort of industry-wide efforts or discussion around mitigating methane? I know, like you talked to Frank Mittloner at UC Davis, they're working on feed additives like red algae, I believe, and some other things that can significantly drop down that. Is that something that is being floated among your sort of local cohort?
We're not seeing a lot of it in the industry yet. I know the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has, I believe they made the statement that they want the cattle industry carbon neutral by 2050. So that's an industry-wide push that we're going to start to see. But if we look at cattle as a whole, first and foremost, let's all agree, methane is not from cow farts. Methane is actually from cow burps. So they burp, they chew their cud. That is where the methane comes from. It's not from the back end of the cow. Just to point that out, because there's a lot of people that talk about that on the news, and the end of the animal is flipped on that particular issue. But cattle actually produce more methane when they're on pasture, when they're eating a forage-rich diet. So there is a lot of pushback against feedlots. There's a pushback against grain-finished diets and things of that nature. But what we have to understand is the carbon footprint of a grass-finished cow versus a grain-finished cow is 67% higher. So grass finishing has a much higher carbon footprint because they have to be around longer. They don't mature as quickly. They don't get to a box fast enough. And when we start to consider methane and things of that nature, or in a feed yard, they have lagoons. That's where all the manure and the waste is trapped. And then it is spread on fields and worked back into the soil. So the circle of carbon within the ag industry is getting more efficient by the day. We're gaining abilities to do that. But we have to let the system work. And what we have to really be worried about is the regulatory issues that may make us less efficient than we've been able to become on our own.
Yeah, that was one of the big criticisms from, I think, going back from the 1970s, when there was a huge push to make the cattle industry more efficient, and they responded by, basically the feedlot system, which reduced methane, which reduced water usage, which reduced land usage. Of course, as you're aware, there's a lot of people that are upset with that. The feedlot system. And I think the problem is, you hear this is a factory farm, and then they don't define what that is, and then they say that just because you have X number of cows, it means that things that have to be horrible, when it really doesn't really matter how many cows you have. You either have good practices or you have bad practices. And there's some huge companies that do very, very good things. There's people that are going to point to the soil sequestration side of things, and they're going to say that we can improve the soil carbon capture by rotational grazing and stuff like that. I don't see why that can't coexist within the system. You have a hybrid system where your pasturing is done a certain way that improves the pasturing. Because all cows start off on grass. That's the people that don't know that. At least for 6 months, and more often a year or more before they end up being finished. And so, what are your thoughts on kind of hybridizing a high energy finish and a more, managed pasture phase?
You can do that. There are some people that do that. For instance, GAP 4. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the different certifications, but if you sell cattle to Whole Foods, you must be GAP 4 certified. It's GAP, the number 4, and they have GAP 1 through 4. Within GAP 4, they actually have to have access to pasture from the feed yard. But if you watch that, they'll have access to a grass pasture over here. They still wait at the feed bunk because they prefer that feed. So I think in practice, it sounds great, in theory, it sounds great, but I think in practice, we'll find we're just putting more land to something that the cattle aren't really going to utilize. Now, it's not a big concern, because the biggest amount of acreage used in agriculture for grazing specifically is ground that's not good for anything else. So, if I look out the window right here, I can see to the horizon, and none of that ground can be farmed. We live in the sand hills of eastern Colorado. If you were to break the root zone with a plow and try to plant something, the wind's going to blow it away. It'd be like trying to grow something on the beach. There's no soil profile here that we could grow something in. And the family has tried. We have a hay rake probably 150 yards from me that's on a big pile of rocks, decorative in our front yard, because it was parked in the 60s and never used again. So I think there's a lot of people that use carbon sequestration, high intensity grazing in a lot of those different plans where they can. Actually, Flying Diamond, a good friend of ours, they're about 100 miles south of us. They do a lot of that because their soil composition is different. The hard part is having a one size fits all solution, even in the state of Colorado, would be pretty tough. Where you're living now, Dr. Baker, and where I'm from in Oregon are not significantly far apart. Most of the forestry ground up there is grazed by cattle, to minimize wildfire risk and things like that. Well, the wildfire risk we have outside right now is it's going to blow 30 miles an hour today. And if somebody drops a cigarette butt out the window, it's going to cause trouble. So it's just a matter of what works where and allowing the system to work. And assuming that we as ag producers are trying to do the right thing. And I think by and large we are. Obviously, there's going to be bad apples in every bunch. I can think of a guy not far from here that overgrazes like nobody's ever seen, and it drives us crazy just driving by there. But it is a system. We've got a ton of people to feed. We've got more people to feed than we've ever had, and we're doing it with less resources. An interesting data point is the United States owns 8% of the world's cattle, and we produce 18% of the world's beef. That is a pretty crazy statistic if you start to think about just the sheer mathematics behind that.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that in the United States, even though we produce the most beef, we're far, far from having the most cattle. I think that honor goes to Brazil and followed by India.
Mm-hmm.
I think they all, both of those have in excess of 200 million cattle, whereas the U.S. typically runs around 95 is usually what our cattle inventory has been running the last few decades. So
yeah, and a big percentage of that is dairy too. It's not even beef cattle.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got. I think I saw something like 9 million dairy cattle, which is a significant amount. So we've got. Yeah, I've seen some of the efficiency numbers from places like India, where at least on the dairy side, I mean, it takes a cow in India like 20 years to produce the same amount of milk that a U.S. cattle would in 1 year or something like that. So it's just an incredible amount of inefficiency that they have with these other systems where a lot of the Indian herd just wanders around through the streets. I mean, they're eating garbage and whatever else they can because they're kind of sacred animals, I suppose. And I don't know what their management's like, but I know a lot of them are apparently pretty infected with a lot of parasites, and so that affects their health and clearly their production. Yeah, let's talk about healthy cattle and outcomes. Because a lot of people seem to think that if you cut corners and kind of abuse the cattle, they'll make you more money. Is there what's your response to people when they say that?
Well, it's just like any system. I mean, if you cheat on a carnivore, you know it, right? If you are rolling jujitsu and you try to pull a fast one on somebody that knows what's going on, you're going to pay the price, and that's not any different than it is in ag. If you try to, shortcut an animal's cycle to get them in a box faster and, make some sort of, sorry, Brett, I was laughing at your comment. If we try to short circuit any of the systems we've got in place, we're going to suffer a quality issue. So, I was on another podcast recently and we were talking about issues we had during COVID with supply and, basically harvesting cattle as quickly as we could. And I was asked, did you just decrease the amount of time animals had on feed? Did you do this? Did you do that? I said, no, it's when they were naturally ready. We aren't going to short circuit the process because we are known for our quality. And I would rather have an awkward conversation about when something's going to be delivered than get a bad phone call from someone that says, boy, your quality really went downhill. I do believe in some areas of agriculture, if we talk farming in particular, there are things we could do better as an industry. Monocropping is something that Joe Rogan's not a doctor, but I guess he could be with all the people he talks to. But he talks about monocrop agriculture, and I've talked to some of my buddies in the farming sector, and they will freely admit that there's some fields they have that have been cornfields for 30 years because it's across the street from an ethanol plant, and it doesn't make sense to switch it. But those guys are now putting in cover crops. They're actually adding more work to themselves to try to keep the soil healthy and sequester carbon, and then they'll actually do cover crops in the fall, graze it all winter, and then go back in and plant corn in the spring. So people are actually going the opposite direction in a lot of agriculture to create more work for themselves, to manage things to a higher degree, because they realize that without the ground or without your asset, which is the ground, you don't really have a reason to be a farmer. You can't cut corners for too long, or it is really going to come back and not only bite you in the butt, but it's going to show all your neighbors what you did.
Yeah, I mean, there's, obviously without soil, you're going to end up without anything. I mean, some people will say farming is about soil management to some degree. I'm sure there's some of that that has to be, it has to be a part of the reality of what's going on. I think I saw the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I believe, talking about the fact that they saw that the methane emissions are much lower than they thought they were from the agricultural sector, and that they recommend that they actually recommend your style of farming more than sort of the regenerative agricultural side. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would strictly say that regenerative is a great word that I believe is thrown around in agriculture a lot. But most of us are regenerative by nature because we have to be regenerative to operate next year. And we have to do the very best we can with what Mother Nature provides. It hasn't rained here in quite a while, but we got a ton of rain this spring. So we have to operate within the confines of what we're given, and we have to try to be regenerative because we don't know when our next rain is going to. Constantly trying to set ourselves up the very best we can to take advantage of what we're provided. And regenerative ag is, as I mentioned, a term that's thrown around a lot. I would really struggle to think of many things in ag that aren't being more naturally regenerative all the time.
Do you have any concerns of 10 years from now, there will be, as Patrick Brown from Impossible Foods, it might be Ethan Brown. I keep confusing the two. One's an Ethan Brown and one's Patrick Brown. One runs Impossible, one runs Beyond Meat. But basically saying that they're going to end you guys by 2030. Is that something you think is likely to happen?
Well, the economics of what they're trying to do are not ideal because they're taking pea protein and other things of that nature that have to be farmed and mixed with other chemicals. So unless they do something to significantly lower their unit cost, or they do something to significantly increase our unit cost, I don't think we have a lot of risk, because I think there's a lot of people that naturally, especially with movements like you guys are doing with Revero, there's a lot of people that are going to say, well, why wouldn't I just eat normal beef instead of this Impossible burger? Like, why would I make that leap? And I don't think they've done a very good job of pointing out the value of that, probably because there isn't much. It was just recently, I think it was Impossible. Their stock fell like 30% one day, and I could have that number wrong, but it was horrible because their Q3 earnings came out and they lost a ton of money in the stock market because they weren't hitting their projections. I'm sure everybody on this call saw the posts on social media of empty grocery store shelves during COVID, but the fake meat areas still were full. And if we're really worried about eating, and we're saying, I'm not that worried. I'm not worried enough to pick that off the shelf. I'm comfortable with where we are today. But what I don't want to do, as the ag industry is so good at doing, is be complacent and look around in 10 years and realize that I have an awkward conversation to have with the 6th generation on this ranch that we are no longer a viable option. Which is why I have conversations like this, or conversations like the one I texted you with the podcast I did a couple of weeks ago. I had another podcast drop yesterday from a gentleman that actually is going to be at the event I'm going to in Tennessee today. As agricultural people, or everybody on this call that supports ag, we need to do a better job as a group of championing our ideas, because sitting around and it'll be fine, nobody's going to bother us, only works for so long. Because the other side of the coin is working really, really hard to make Impossible Meat a thing.
Yeah, I think your point about, just the average person that just kind of wanted to be left alone and do his thing, it's not an option anymore. I think you've seen a lot of people in a whole bunch of different things that are going on right now. A lot of people are saying, look, it's too late. It's no longer viable to sit back and be passive and not say anything. So it's good to see people in the ag industry, particularly on the beef side, are waking up to this and realizing that, while beef has been, I think the primary lack of sort of promotion is like beef sells itself. It tastes good. It's wonderful. It's delicious. It's an easy product. You don't have to put a lot of marketing behind it. But unfortunately, they're basically having just nonstop, negative campaigning against it right now, which I think you have to respond to. So,
well,
good for you for
the
doing
other weird data point is, I think it was in 1970, the average American ate like 110 pounds of beef a year. And through some of the anti-fat campaigns of the 70s and the 80s, and some of the other things that they were talking about diet during those time periods, that's dropped to that 80 pound per year number I mentioned. So we've already lost 30% of the market in the last 5 decades. That's a bit scary if you look at that trend.
Yeah, that's pretty. I think beef consumption in the U.S. peaked in 77 or 76, and then it's down about 30% over. But in the last few years, it's started to trend up slightly. Not hugely, but certainly up from where it was. And what we see is chicken has largely supplanted beef. I think I don't know if it's part of it's because it's a cheaper product. But the meat consumption has been pretty steady, but it's been more chicken than beef for sure.
And the numbers are, as a country, the United States harvests 35 million cows a year. The United States harvests 156 million pigs a year. And the beef and the pork markets are about equal on poundage. It's around 28 million pounds a year. Well, we harvest 9 billion chickens annually, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 44 or 45 million pounds. It's nearly double. And a lot of that goes to export. A lot of that goes to other countries, of course. But we do have to understand, what we're up against from a numbers standpoint.
Yeah. Jeff, we've kind of zipped through an hour. It's been fascinating. Can you let people know where they can go to get some Colorado craft beef? And if you've got some social media or any other websites you want to let us know about?
Yeah, we are at Colorado Craft Beef on all social channels. We are not very active on Twitter. Instagram is kind of where we live most of the time. If you reach out on any DMs with Facebook or Instagram, that goes directly to my wife and I. We don't have any employees. And, keep an eye out. We're going to be doing some different launches, some different giveaways over the next few weeks, walking into Christmas. One thing we do a lot of this time of year is a lot of corporate gifts. So, if you own a company and you want to give something to your employees, we can make that happen. And, if you ever got any questions, just reach out and we'll do our very best to get back to you right away.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work. Thanks for coming on, and maybe we'll check back down the road a little bit and see how things are still going.
Of course. Thank you guys. Appreciate the time.
All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye now.
Join Revero.health for a 30-day free trial to get access to live Q&A with VIP guests, social community meetings, member discounts, low-carb healthcare providers list, forum, workouts, monthly challenges, early access to podcasts, recipes, carnivore diet guide, fasting guide, shred guide, and much more.